September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler launched a full-scale military assault on Poland, using airstrikes, tanks, and infantry in an overwhelming and brutal display of modern military aggression that had never been seen before. The events on this day began a Second World War that would affect almost all of the civilized world, and by the time it would end almost 6 years later, would consume over 60 million human lives.
Most historians believe the surprise attack was unprovoked. Still others believe that while it may indeed have been unprovoked, it should not have been a surprise at all. There were many signs and many warnings along the way of what was to come, and there was a great deal of opportunities for the Allied forces, most notably at the time, France and England, to act and to prevent the worst from happening. These many opportunities were met with the greatest effort to act with diplomacy and to prevent another war at all costs. These acts of appeasement and the lessons that may be learned from them are the subject of our discussion today.
Hello, I'm Jake Cherkis.
And I'm Jake Marriage.
And thank you for joining us in our discussion of appeasement and the events leading up to World War II. Some years after the war had begun, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt asked Prime Minister Winston Churchill what the war should be called. Churchill's immediate answer was, "the unnecessary war." What did Churchill mean by that? To truly understand this, we must go all the way back to the end of World War I. That conflict took place from 1914 to 1918 and was known at the time as the War to End All Wars. By the time it ended, Europe was torn apart. Many millions were dead, and the map of Europe looked very different. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919 and made very clear that the Germans were the aggressors and were to blame for much of the pain and suffering in Europe.
The terms of the treaty were severe and included a war guilt clause where Germany had to accept the blame for the war and pay reparations over £6.6 billion to France, England, Russia, and other countries of the winning side. The treaty also put strict limitations on the German military, designed to prevent another uprising in power that could ever again threaten their European neighbors.
The Rhineland was completely demilitarized, and it was thought that it would serve as a sufficient security buffer against any future attack on France.
Also, Germany's army was limited to 100,000 soldiers, they were not permitted an air force, and their navy was limited to 6 battleships and no submarines.
Germany also had to forfeit their overseas colonies to the League of Nations, which was created to be an international peacekeeping organization, and the Germans were excluded from membership.
These terms left the German people economically depressed and very bitter.
Adolf Hitler's rise to power began when he assumed control of the Nazi Party in 1921. By 1933, the Nazi Party was declared the National Party of Germany, giving Hitler complete and total power. Hitler began violation of the Treaty of Versailles by building up the military far above the 100,000-man limit. He also expanded the Navy and developed an Air Force, again breaking specific limitations set out in the treaty. In 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, which was strictly forbidden. In response, the League of Nations tolerated these acts, rather than take any actions that could lead to war.
Neville Chamberlain assumed the position of Prime Minister of England in 1937 and began a foreign policy toward Hitler that would later become known as appeasement. He believed peace was more important than confrontation, so he permitted Hitler to violate many of the restrictions set upon Germany under the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler, however, continued his non-compliance and even accelerated his military rearmament as a result of Chamberlain's appeasement. In March of 1938, the Nazis marched into Austria in Hitler's boldest show of aggression to date, the annexation of Austria.
Although this was by far the most blatant and aggressive breach of the treaty thus far, it can be said that Hitler himself foretold of this and other intentions clearly in his autobiography Mein Kampf, which was published in 1925 and 1926. Winston Churchill later said that after Hitler's ascension to power, no book deserved more intense scrutiny. After expanding his empire to Austria, Hitler now desired the Sudetenland, the land in Czechoslovakia along the border of Germany. Hitler threatened to invade all of Czechoslovakia if he wasn't given the Sudetenland. He defended this demand by claiming that 3 million Sudetens living there shared a common ethnicity with Germans, but were a minority in their own country. The leaders of Czechoslovakia were not in favor of this, and knew the threat that this could be to their sovereignty. But when Hitler invited Prime Minister Chamberlain, President Daladier of France, and Mussolini of Italy to Munich at the Munich Conference on September 30th, 1938, these four men signed an agreement which permitted Germany to take the Sudetenland. No Czech representative was invited to these discussions. This left the Czechs vulnerable to attack from the Germans because this region was crucial to their defense. At the Munich Conference, Hitler promised that there would be no further demands for land and that his intentions were for a long and lasting peace. Chamberlain returned from Munich triumphant, believing that he had secured peace for Britain and all of Europe.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace.
By this time, critics of Chamberlain and Daladier's policy of appeasement were growing. Although the people of England and France still did not have the taste for war, it was becoming much more obvious that Hitler and the Nazis could not be trusted.
One man spoke louder and stronger than others, though. Winston Churchill spoke in the House of Commons in Britain on October 5th, 1938.
He said, "We have sustained a total and unmitigated defeat, and that France has suffered even more than we have. We are in the presence of a disaster of the first magnitude, which has befallen Great Britain and France. Do not let us blind ourselves to that. I do not grudge our loyal, brave people who are ready to do their duty, no matter what the cost, who never flinched under the strain of last week. I do not grudge them the natural, spontaneous outbursts of joy and relief when they learned that the hard ordeal would no longer be required of them at the moment. But they should know the truth. They should know that there has been a gross neglect and deficiency in our defenses. They should know that we have sustained a defeat without war, the consequences of which will travel far with us along our road. They should know that we have passed an awful milestone in our history. And I do not suppose that this is the end. This is only the beginning of the reckoning."
6 months later, in March of 1939, Germany invaded and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. There was nothing in place to stop them. By now, all knew that Hitler's agreement in Munich was a lie, and that the policy of appeasement had failed.
Britain and France condemned the full Czech invasion and gave assurances to Poland that they would be defended if attacked. But still no action was taken. Why? Hitler's real goal of world dominance was now clear for all the world to see, and an attack on Poland was a fairly predictable next step. So the question has been asked throughout history since. Why did the Allies continue to wait? And at what cost?
Marshal von Keitel was a high-ranking general in the German army and was its war minister for most of the war. He was also acting as military governor of the Sudetenland in October of 1938. After the war was over, at the Nuremberg trials of over 22 Nazi war criminals, Keitel was asked the following question by Colonel Eger, representing Czechoslovakia. Would the Reich have attacked Czechoslovakia in 1938 if the Western powers had stood by Prague? Keitel's answer is very telling. He said, "Certainly not. We were not strong enough militarily. The object of Munich was to get Russia out of Europe, to gain time, and to complete the German armaments."
Only 6 months later, Germany was well prepared, as we all know today, and well positioned to launch that brutal assault on Poland that began the Second World War. What would have happened if the Allies had said no in September of 1938 or stepped in militarily in the March of 1939? We will never really know the answer, but there is certainly enough evidence to show that the conflict could have been very different. Many brave lives might have been saved.
Have we learned the lessons of appeasement? The question is still a relevant one today, in 2011, as we see hostile countries like Iran and North Korea strive to acquire nuclear weapons. Here is a recent clip of Secretary of State Clinton commenting on Iran's insistence on going forward with their aggressive plans for nuclear research and their true intentions.
I know I heard some of the news coverage that, oh my goodness, the Iranians are starting the reactor. That is not the issue. They are entitled to peaceful civilian nuclear power. They are not entitled to nuclear weapons. There's two different processes.
Let's hope we have learned history's hard lessons of appeasement. I am Jake Marriage.
And I'm Jay Cherkis. Thank you for joining us.